morning, everyone. Welcome to the program. This is your Business Morning. We're live to you from Lagos, the home of financial markets, and of course the home to Channels Television. This is our global headquarters where money lives. Let's get the show started. I am Bosun Omofai. Of course, it's no longer news, and it's still in the news this morning. Late yesterday evening, Nigeria's Finance Minister, Kemi Adeosun, suspends the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Mounir Gwarzo, as well as the head of Legal Department, Mrs. Anastasia Brima, and the head of the SEC's media, Abdusalam Naif Habu. The statement says this will allow for unhindered investigation of several allegations of financial impropriety against the three individuals, in particular the head of the SEC. The Ministry of Finance, a very five-paragraph press statement says the suspension of Gwarzo was in line with, quote, Public Service Rules number 03405 and 03406. Meantime, the administrative panel of inquiry has been set up, according to the statement, to investigate and determine the culpability of the Director General of the SEC, Mounir Gwarzo. Gwarzo was asked to hand over immediately to the most senior officer at the Commission, pending the conclusion of inquiry. Of course, we have a bit of that a few weeks ago, some media news around Gwarzo involving in some allegations of financial impropriety, in which he's said to be a director in some private organizations, which also did some contracts for the SEC. We'll get to those stories today, tomorrow, and in the days ahead. The key rationale for his suspension from the SEC, of course, as the Supervisory Ministry of Finance have since stepped into the case and asked Gwarzo to step aside pending the API, the Administrative Panel of Inquiry, to determine whether he's culpable or not. But again, let's look at the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's over the last 10 years. Let's backtrack a little bit and see the number of heads that the Securities Commission have had. The rate at which the SEC chiefs are changed within the last 10 years brings some concerns to some investors. Let's backtrack a little bit into this story. Gwarzo is the fourth head of the Securities and Exchange Commission to be suspended over the last 10 years. Let's go back. That's the man, Musa Al-Faki. Musa Al-Faki was the Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission, appointed in October 2004. Musa Al-Faki back then was a stockbroker. He became the head of the SEC just as the market boom was about to start and just as the announcement of the banking sector consolidation under the central bank was announced. So it was Musa Al-Faki that superintended the capital markets during the time when the market boom occurred through 2004 and 2007. They had the market meltdown in 2008. Then by 2009, Musa Al-Faki resigned in the month of April and handed over to an interim Director General in the month of May 2009. Musa Al-Faki resigned just before his tenure ended. There are a lot of news about why he resigned and why he didn't resign, but of course that's subject to history. So Musa Al-Faki left the SEC. Then you had Daisy Ekine, who became the interim head of the SEC. Ms. Daisy Ekine then was a executive commissioner at the SEC, and Musa Al-Faki handed over to him in 2009. Then, after that, we had Aruma Ote, who became the substantive Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission for a couple of years. But she also was sent on another compulsory leave or suspension, as you want to put it, by the then board of the Securities and Exchange Commission. According to, of course, that piece of news in the history, the suspension of Aruma Ote back then was to allow unfettered investigations into how she used Project 50 event program of 2010 and the House of Representatives a probe into market infractions of 2008. So, Aroma Ote was suspended in circumstances relating to financial issues when the SEC back then in 2010, 7 years ago or 8 years ago, rolled out what we call Project 50 program, and the board believed the administrative inquiry was enough to put the then Director General on compulsory leave. She never made it back to office. Then she handed over. Then Desi Ekine was asked to come back for the second time as an interim Director General of the SEC. So it's 2 times within the last 10 years that Desi Ekine became the head of the SEC for a few months after Aroma Ote, and then in May 2015, Mounir Gwarzo, who's suspended now yesterday afternoon, became the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So Gwarzo has spent 2 years and 6 months thereabout in office. That's where we are right now. So the SEC has had technically 4 heads in the last 10 years, and that's how bad it can get for the regulator expected to regulate the market and keeps changing the Director General almost every 2 years. But let's look at Gwarzo's tenure at the Securities and Exchange Commission. He became the Director General in May 2015, as you know, as the substantive head from his position as an Executive Commissioner within the Securities Commission. Gwarzo started his career in Kano State at the Ministry of Trade in 1988. He worked at the Nigerian Stock Exchange briefly and other securities firms before heading to the SEC. Until his removal or suspension, I beg your pardon, Gwarzo chairs the Africa and Middle East Regional Committee of IOSCO. IOSCO is the International Organization of Securities Commission. That's the bodies regulating securities markets all over the world. That's the umbrella body for them. He was the chairman of for Africa and Middle East. But what has he been doing in 2 years and a few months while he was in office? Mounir Gwarzo took on enforcement of market discipline on becoming the Director General, in particular against big market firms and listed companies in relation to historical infractions, mismanagement, and other issues with some